At the end of World War I, the Paris Peace Conference was put as a formal international meeting to establish terms of peace between nations or countries. The military grade for the Japanese in World War I earned a spot as a victor at the Paris Peace Conference. The Japanese would have felt weak compared to the other great nations. Though the Japanese didn't have much say, they were there. The United States, Britain, France, and Italy all had their proclamations in terms of peace. The Japanese presented 3 peace demands. The first 2 were territorial in nature, and the third was a racial equality proposal. Baron Makino, the Japanese delegate for equality of all nations, stated that the equality of nations being a basic principle of the League of Nations, the high contracting parties agreed to accord as soon as possible to all alien nations of states members of League equal and just treatment in every respect.
Countries gave their thoughts and opinions about the racial diplomatic solution to peace, but the Americans rebuffed their proposal. The failure of the proposal symbolized the weakness in Japanese peace diplomacy. This racial political judgment was influenced by the yellow peril. This racial color metaphor of the people of Eastern Asia poses a danger for the Western world. After the rebuffment, the Japanese went home angry. When the Depression in 1929 hit, it took an economic blow on Japan. Japan had a few natural resources, no oil, coal, or fuels that Japan needs to prosper as a great nation. Japan relied on Americans' fuels and resources to produce. So Japan looks inwards for a solution. Japan calls for a nationalist movement. Army General Hideki Tojo sets an invasion on Manchuria in 1931. After the invasion of northeastern China, the world was horrified. After some time, Hitler began to amass. World War II hit. In 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's goal was just to provide raw materials. He wanted to keep as much out of the war as possible.
But meanwhile, America is dealing and helping with the affairs of Europe. Japan continues to take land. This causes Hitler to join forces with Tojo. FDR guessed if I could put sanctions on Japan, this would avoid going with force. So he imposed harsh sanctions on Japan. He takes down all exports to Japan. Japan relied on oil. 80% of Japan's oil was an American export. Franklin D. Roosevelt says if only they remove their expansionist action, all imports will continue. So Japan decides to look closer for resources. The Dutch Indies was a rich oil field. Their problem was that the American-owned Philippines would block their expansion to the Dutch Indies. The Japanese gambled that the Americans wouldn't fight in the Pacific, Atlantic, and Europe all at the same time. The Japanese plan was not to defeat the US, but to wear them out. They knew that we should not fight with an economic giant, but they thought that they did have the Japanese spirit which would win them the war. But to do this, they needed the Navy, so they put the Navy officer Yamamoto in charge. He knew their only chance of winning was to take out the entire Pacific Fleet, which is now at Pearl Harbor. He gambled that we have a 50% chance. The fact that we have to go 4,000 miles of open ocean without being spied on, so he took the gamble.
Japan had been planning for months for the attack. For 11 months, Yamamoto has been planning and refining its plan. Ironically, at the same time, they were trying to diplomatically relieve tensions with the US in the Pacific. Meanwhile, America cracked Japan's messages and figured they were gearing up for war. America sent a distress call to all Pacific bases, but Hawaii was not alerted. So Kimmel started to make sure the ships were ready and everybody had training. He knew the war was close and we needed to be ready to assist when the time comes. At 7 a.m. on December 7, 1941, Japan started to initiate its attack on Pearl Harbor, but 55 minutes later, Japan officially started the attack. The surprise attack lasted 75 minutes. The battle was a huge loss for the Americans.
That day, they lost a total of 2,403 people and 1,178 casualties. 159 U.S. aircraft were damaged and 169 were destroyed. 16 U.S. ships were damaged and 3 major battleships were destroyed, including U.S., Arizona, and Missouri. More than half of the people killed were on Arizona. This historic Navy defeat started the calling Remember Pearl Harbor. On December 8, 1941, FDR formally declared war on Japan. A few days later, Germany and Italy declared war on America. America was now officially in the war. That same day, Franklin D. Roosevelt gave a speech to Congress. FDR said that we were at peace with the nation. 87 years before World War II, Japan and America had made diplomatic solutions to keep peace in the Pacific. Before November 26, the whole note was sent as the last peace proposal to Japan, but it arrived after the departure of the ships. Japan implied that it seemed useless to continue the existing diplomatic negotiations. That was very true. That same night of Pearl Harbor, Japan attacked Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippine Islands, and Wake Island. As FDR said, a day that will live in infamy. Japan had failed diplomatically. FDR firmly said that no matter how long it may take us, the American people in their righteous mind will win through absolute victory. The Battle of Midway would become the most decisive sea battle ever fought. This battle would ultimately decide the victory. Japan knew that they had to destroy the entire American fleet to ensure the safety of Japan. The Japanese plan was to set a trap at Midway Island, but a few days before, a Japanese plane flew by a designated area classified as AF. They recently found that AF is Midway. America now counterattacked them. When Japan started the attack, their target planes were not there. Then those planes appeared right above them. They now had a chance to defend themselves. The Japanese now knew that the battle was an equal fight now. All they could do is fight and hope that the tide is their way. The tides of the war turned multiple times. The point that could change the tide of the war and battle was when the Americans sent 2 squadrons of dive bombers to find the Japanese fleet. The 2 squadrons had searched endlessly on the ocean. While almost in the battle, unexpectedly, the head captain of the 2 squadrons made a turn. He saw the Japanese fleet on the horizon. At 10:05 a.m., he found the entire Japanese fleet. Then they had a chance to change the tide, so they went in.
At that time, evidently, a squadron of dive bombers from U.S. Yorktown intercepted them. Now they had 4 squadrons to take out 5 carriers from 2 angles. In 5 minutes, they landed direct hits on 3 carriers. 3 of the 5 Japanese carriers are destroyed, but the Japanese didn't give up. They tried to attack but failed. Now 5 of their carriers were destroyed. Their plan was a horrible backfire, but the defeat was lied to the Japanese people as well the Battle of Iwo Jima. After FDR died, Harry S. Truman took the presidency and the project. He had plans to use 2 bombs to destroy Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The 2 bombs were Fat Man and Little Boy, but conversations between Truman and Samuel Cabot stated that Christians deeply disturbed over the use of atomic bombs against Japanese cities, and because their use sets an extremely dangerous precedent for the future of mankind. This topic was highly debated whether it was ethical, but Americans need this victory. So when the 2 bombs were made, they set course. On August 6, 1945, B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima, causing 135,000 casualties with around 60,000 deaths. On August 9th, 1945, B-29 bomber Boxer dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki, causing 64,000 casualties with around 39,000 deaths.
Around 1 month later, Japan officially signed the instrument of surrender. On September 2nd, 1945, on the ship USS Missouri, Japan stated that we hereby proclaim the unconditional surrender to the Allied powers of the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters and of all Japanese armed forces. The war was over. When New York reported the news, sailors would grab random women and kiss them. It was later referred to as VJ Day. Although the battle was a historic failure in diplomacy, it formed a close friendship between Japan and America. To this day, Japan is one of America's closest allies. Because of the war, later that year on October 29, 1945, the United Nations was formed. This intergovernmental organization to try to maintain peace. This failure was a lesson and a benefit for all.